Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to unravel a relationship that often flies under the radar, really, yet it has some pretty significant implications for the Middle East. I'm talking about the connection between Qatar and Israel. We've gathered quite a range of sources for you. There's a U.S. State Department cable from 2007, trade data analyses from Ynet News and the American Conservative, and some background from Wikipedia, too.
Right.
Our mission, basically, is to get past the surface level here and really dig into the, surprising layers of interaction between these two, especially considering Qatar's, let's say, complicated role in the region.
It really is a fascinating paradox, isn't it? For long stretches, no formal diplomatic ties, officially, anyway.
Exactly.
Yet some kind of relationship in different forms hasn't just stuck around, but it seems to have evolved.
So what drove these connections? And maybe more importantly, how does Qatar manage, engaging with Israel while also backing groups that are completely opposed to it?
That's the puzzle, yeah. That's what we need to try and piece together for you today.
Okay, so let's start maybe back in the mid-90s. It seems like there was a time of more open engagement.
Yeah, relatively speaking.
Qatar was actually one of the first Gulf states, Arab Gulf states, to host an Israeli Trade Representation Office. That was 1996.
Pretty early, yeah.
But this wasn't purely about business, was it? That 2007 State Department cable, it seems to suggest something else was the main point.
Absolutely. The cable really highlights that the office, its function, went beyond just, helping trade deals along. It turned into a platform for political engagement. You saw high-level visits like Shimon Peres in 2007 and interactions between civil society groups. It was sort of subtle way for Qatar to engage politically without going for a full normalization.
Right. And the official trade numbers back then, 2007, were maybe around $2 million a year. Qatar selling petrochemicals, buying Israeli high-tech.
Yeah, relatively small numbers.
But the cable hints that there was potentially a lot more going on sort of beneath the surface.
That's what's really intriguing, isn't it? The idea that the real trade could have been up to 4 times higher.
Wow. How?
Well, this unofficial trade apparently used third countries. So Israeli farm goods, for example, might get shipped out labeled as coming from Egypt or Jordan.
Sneaky.
It just shows the very delicate line both sides were trying to walk,
And it wasn't just goods moving around. Qatar Airways apparently had a pretty busy office in Israel for a while.
Yeah, that's mentioned too. Thousands of Israelis were using Doha as a hub to fly to Southeast Asia.
That level of connection, even if it's indirect, people actually traveling through, it says something.
It does. It eventually closed, or apparently over money disagreements, which kind of shows the limits when things aren't official.
Sure.
But the fact it ran for so long, serving so many people, suggests a level of, let's say, pragmatic acceptance. The cable also notes Qatar generally gave visas to Israelis if they applied in advance. And if business people hit problems, that Israeli office in Doha often smoothed things over. So it paints this picture of quiet help when it suited both sides.
But then things changed quite dramatically in 2009. Qatar officially cuts off trade relations after Operation Cast Lid. What was behind that shift? It seems pretty abrupt.
Well, that move really highlights the massive public pressure and regional pressure Qatar was under. After a big conflict like that, keeping open trade with Israel just wasn't politically sustainable.
Right.
Then, in 2010, Qatar sort of tested the waters about restoring trade, but they had conditions. They wanted to send aid to Gaza, and they wanted Israel to publicly acknowledge it.
And Israel said no.
Israel rejected those terms, yeah. And that probably cemented the break, at least the official break.
But even after this public split, it's not like everything just stopped, right? There are hints of continued, maybe quieter engagement.
Exactly. It didn't all just go dark. Think about those 2013 reports, which Wikipedia mentions, about Qatar possibly helping Israel bring Yemenite Jews to Israel.
Interesting.
Now, if that's true, it suggests a pretty remarkable level of secret cooperation on humanitarian stuff, completely separate from the public arguments.
Yeah.
And the Qatari Prime Minister also made comments that year about potential land swaps in a final deal between Israelis and Palestinians, which some in Israel saw quite positively.
Yeah.
It hinted at maybe some common ground on diplomatic ideas.
Okay, but the mood swings back again pretty hard after Operation Protective Edge in 2014.
It does.
That's when we heard really strong criticism from Israeli officials about Qatar supporting Hamas. Some were even calling Qatar a sponsor of terrorism. That's a major sticking point.
It absolutely is. For Israel, Qatar's support for Hamas is seen as a huge obstacle to, well, peace and security.
Yeah.
But even with that really charged atmosphere, pragmatic stuff kept happening.
Like what?
Well, in 2015, Qatar's ambassador in Gaza reportedly went straight to Israel to get approval for construction materials for the Strip, bypassing the Palestinian Authority.
Right, direct contact.
And later that year, Qatar actually hosted talks in Doha between Israel and Hamas about a potential ceasefire.
So it's this constant back and forth, conflict and condemnation on one hand, practical dealings on the other.
That's exactly it. That interplay defines the whole relationship.
Which brings us to 2017 and that diplomatic crisis where Qatar was basically isolated by several other Arab states. And Israel actually sided with the anti-Qatar group and kicked Al Jazeera out of Israel.
Yeah, that was a very public move against Qatar.
Seems counterintuitive given the other connections.
It just shows how Israel's strategic thinking can be, well, fluid, opportunistic, maybe. While they were dealing with Qatar on some things, they also saw a chance to align with Qatar's rivals, who shared Israeli concerns about Qatar's regional influence, especially its support for Islamist movements.
Okay, so that brings us neatly to Qatar's wider strategy, its influence in the region.
Yes.
That UNET News analysis really pushes this idea of Qatar using its huge financial clout through the Qatar Investment Authority, right, and its diplomacy to gain political leverage, punching above its weight, essentially.
Definitely. Their investments are everywhere, globally, giving them influence in loads of international bodies. And their activities in Israel, like high-tech investments, that diamond trade deal in 2021, that suggests a very long-term strategic view.
And those big donations to American universities, that's caused some controversy too, hasn't it? Concerns about buying influence.
Certainly has raised eyebrows and sparked debates, yeah.
And then you have Al Jazeera, funded by Qatar. Now, they claim to be objective, but that UNET News piece argues it often pushes a subversive discourse aimed at Arab populations, often critical of their own governments.
Right, potentially stirring things up. And that has definitely fueled Qatar's image as, well, a troublemaker in some other Arab capitals.
That perceived role in sort of encouraging dissent, it's caused real friction with neighbors, hasn't it? Some see Qatar as actively trying to destabilize them.
Without a doubt. Yet, and here's the paradox again, Qatar also positions itself as the go-to mediator. In hostage situations, including Israelis held by Hamas, it's deeply complex, and for Qatar's neighbors, probably incredibly frustrating.
It's a real balancing act.
And you can't forget the huge strategic asset they have. The largest U.S. military base in the Middle East is right there in Qatar. That gives them massive leverage with the West.
Let's circle back to those trade figures quickly. The newer data we have from Trading Economics, it looks totally different from those early hints.
Very different.
In 2022, Israeli exports to Qatar were just $146,000, mostly fruit and plastics. That's a huge drop from the potential $5 million plus talked about in 2007.
That sharp fall really shows the effect of cutting off official trade ties.
Yeah.
Those earlier, bigger numbers probably reflect that time of more open, though still unofficial, contact.
Yeah.
And if you look at Qatari imports from Israel in 2015, it was tiny too. Under $29,000. Things like essential oils, machinery.
Yeah.
The official economic links, based on these numbers anyway, they really don't capture the whole story.
It's almost like there are two tracks running side by side. The public face of no relations, maybe even hostility, versus the quiet interactions and potential strategic alignment happening behind the scenes.
Exactly. We saw those earlier diplomatic things like Perez visits, but then also more grassroots stuff like Qatar funding that football stadium, the Doha Stadium in Saqnen in Israel.
Right. Those seem like opposite signals.
They do.
Yeah.
But maybe the cultural stuff was about building bridges, people to people, while the high-level meetings showed a practical need to talk about critical issues even without formal relations.
And that need to talk was clear, again, with Qatar helping out with the 2023 Gaza ceasefire and hostage exchange. But then you get these really jarring moments, like that statement from a Qatari Legislative Council member in April 2024, just awful language about Jews, basically seeming to justify the October 7th attacks. How do you square that with everything else?
You almost can't. That statement is deeply disturbing, and it shows that the ideological divides are still very much there, running underneath all the practical dealings.
Yeah.
It just highlights how unstable and fragile this whole relationship can be. But even then, you had reports of a planned meeting between Israeli and Qatari leaders in Norway late last year, December 2023.
Right, and those temporary direct flights for the World Cup in 2022.
Exactly. So the connections, fragile as they might be, keep happening despite the lack of official normalization.
That UNET News analysis has a really interesting take. It suggests Qatar sees its relationship with Israel as a strategic asset, and it quotes this idea that the road to Washington runs through Jerusalem. That sounds very calculated, very self-interested.
It certainly suggests a strong element of realpolitik, doesn't it? Keeping lines open to Israel, even quietly, could give Qatar useful leverage with the U.S., especially on regional security stuff.
Makes sense.
The analysis also mentioned an Egyptian blogger seeing the Qatargate scandal as basically exposing a hidden warm relationship between Israel and Qatar. Again, highlighting that gap between public statements and what might be happening privately.
And then there are those allegations which Qatar strongly denies that some of the money they sent to Gaza ended up with Hamas's military wing. That must fuel the debate inside Israel about Qatar's real motives.
Oh, absolutely. It's led to this split within the Israeli security world. Some want to take a really hard line, maybe even label Qatar a state sponsor of terrorism.
Right.
But others argue, no, we need to keep some level of engagement, keep them as a potential mediator, don't push them away completely, and risk making things even more unstable.
So this brings us back to that view pushed hard in the UNET News piece of Qatar as a kind of villain figure, an enemy even in the eyes of several other Arab states.
Yeah.
There's support for groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, the Taliban, that's seen as backing radical political Islam, which is a direct threat to the existing regimes in the region.
And the support has definitely caused huge friction. The UNET News article mentions that past Arab boycott over its subversive activities, and all the criticism of Al Jazeera for shaping Arab public opinion in ways that challenge governments. There's real suspicion, even resentment towards Qatar in many Arab capitals because of this stuff.
Wikipedia also mentions a claim from an Emirati author that Qatar used to boycott countries that normalized ties with Israel back in the late 20th century. True or not, it adds to this picture of Qatar being maybe out of sync with other Arab states moving towards normalization.
So what you end up with is this picture of a country with policies that seem to constantly contradict each other.
Yeah.
Dealing with Israel when it suits their strategic goals, but at the same time, supporting groups that are fiercely anti-Israel and seen as destabilizing by their own neighbors.
And they're not afraid to flex their muscles, are they? Like threatening to cut off gas to Europe over human rights laws.
Exactly. It shows we're willing to use their influence quite aggressively, sometimes creating friction regionally and internationally.
Okay, so trying to wrap this up. What we see is this incredibly complex, often paradoxical relationship between Qatar and Israel.
Definitely complex.
No official ties for long periods, but all sorts of engagement still happening. Cycles of trade, then public breaks, then this more pragmatic behind-the-scenes stuff. Qatar seems to be constantly walking this tightrope, playing the mediator sometimes, but seen by many others, especially Arab neighbors, as maybe fanning the flames.
That line from the 2007 State Department cable about Qatar's seemingly contradictory policy, it still feels spot on today, doesn't it?
It really does.
They're always balancing their dealings with Israel against their ambitions and how they're seen in the wider Arab world. It's a tricky dance, and it keeps shaping what happens in the region.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. Given all these complex, often hidden connections, and considering how some of Qatar's neighbors view it as a disruptive force, how should we interpret Qatar's role in the Middle East's ongoing conflicts and diplomacy?
Yeah, what do all these contradictions really tell us about Qatar's long-term goals in such a volatile part of the world?
A lot to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.